Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. First, we want to say thank you for joining us again. This is our second of hopefully many events like this so that we can get the community involved and just have this open discussion about different topics that we've got going at the port. First, I want to introduce myself. So my name is Priscilla Torres. I have been with the Port of Corpus Christi for going on the last 4 years now. I work on the commercial side, so I currently work with customers and manage cargoes that are coming in and out of our port. Before that, some of you may recognize me. I was part of a local media outlet, and I did that for about 10 years. But most importantly, I am from here. So when this opportunity came about, I jumped on it. I thought it was very important to have conversations like this and open up the floor to just talk about what we're doing here at the Port of Corpus Christi and really get feedback from our community and see what we can do to make this a better port overall. So before we get started, I do want to just go over a couple of guidelines. I know that we did go over these last time, so for some of you who were here, this may sound repetitive, but just to go over it for the people who were not here, I'll say that if we can have you just listen actively and respect to others' perspectives, even if you disagree with them, speak from your own experience and avoid making assumptions about others' experiences or beliefs. Avoid personal attacks, name calling, or any other behavior that could be perceived as disrespectful or harmful, and allow everyone a chance to speak and be mindful of time constraints. I was not at the first one, but I watched it the other day, and so I want to thank everybody who was here because everyone who did ask questions during that first event were very receptive and mindful of other people who are wanting to go up and ask questions. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I want to introduce my colleague, Jeff Pollack. So Jeff, let's just get started with, if you could tell us a little bit about your background and what is your role here at the Port of Corpus Christi? Okay,
yeah, thanks. So first of all, I would also like to echo Priscilla, really so much appreciate that y'all are here this evening. I know just like I am, you're either away from kids, away from spouses. I know the food isn't that great, right? Good enough, but not good enough to justify any of those things. So the food itself is not enough to bring you out is what I was trying to say with that. But so appreciate you being here. I sound really loud, huh? Don't sound that loud? Okay, thank you. Feedback. So this series is entitled Community Conversation for a reason. I feel a little sheepish that Priscilla and I are up on this stage in these chairs. It's like really the only format that allows for us to see the whole room. But we very much envision this as a dialogue. I think there is a certain amount of information that we're hoping to communicate, and there's also a reciprocal amount of information we're hoping to get back. So please know that we envision this as interactive. I think we'll let you all get through dinner first, maybe for that part, but this is about engagement, and as Priscilla mentioned, it's our intention to have events, in an equivalent format on this and other topics on a very regular basis, sort of indefinitely from this point forward. So again, thank you so much for being here. Anyway, introduction. Yes. It really doesn't seem too loud to y'all? Okay, all right. I'm literally hearing my voice echoing in my ears. It's sort of unnerving. My name is Jeff Pollack. I am the Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer at the Port. I have been here for just about 5 years. I came to the Port to start the planning department and have grown into this role. Before coming to the Port, I ran a federally funded transportation planning group in this area called the Metropolitan Planning Organization. I worked at that time quite a bit with Sean Strawbridge, who was not yet CEO at the Port, and that's how I got to know Sean and got to know about opportunities here. My background is in environmental science, and my graduate degree is in coastal environmental management. I grew up on the East Coast, My wife and I were in the Carolinas for both North and South, for about a decade before moving to the Corpus area 17 years ago for what I thought was going to be 18 months. She's a marine biology professor at A&M. We came for her postdoc, and 2 kids and a bunch of dogs later and a couple houses later, and life happens, right? So I guess just wrap this up by saying my purview at the port effectively includes everything related to planning, everything related to environmental. So effectively everything the port hasn't done that much of in the last 100 years of its history. And so I am on point for our high-level commercial strategy around the hydrogen value chain, what we're here to talk about tonight, and also our strategy on carbon management in a holistic sense. And those two are obviously very much related, and I'm hoping to talk about both of them based on where y'all want the conversation to go.
Perfect. So leads us to our next question. So why hydrogen and why now?
Okay, yeah. And so maybe before I mention that, I mean, this format of sort of Q&A, what we were hoping to do is, Priscilla is really good at sort of keeping things on track. Maybe I'm a little more divergent in my comments. And so the idea we were thinking is that between the two of us, we could get a certain amount of information out, just in the format of 2 or 3 questions, and then open it up and spend as long as you care to. I know we said till 7, but honestly, I'll stay as long as it takes to receive whatever questions you may have. So why hydrogen and why now? That alone is a full night, but let me turn that around for a second. Just by a show of hands, who in this room, and we didn't do this last time we had one of these events, and it was a mistake on my part, just by a show of hands, who in this room believes that actively addressing climate change and greenhouse gas emissions is a planetary priority? Okay. And that's the majority of folks. I personally feel that way. I mean, in the interest of transparency, it's something that has been a part of my professional trajectory for 20 years. So there are kind of 2 answers to this question, right? On one hand, and I'll give the sort of pragmatic answer first, that we're a public port authority. Our job is to facilitate commerce in the interest of economic prosperity. We are, in that sense, we function very much like a utility. When commercial interests approach us, want to lease property from us, want to develop industry here, the job for us is to receive that, to vet that, to make sure it is consistent with our core values, our environmental policy, our commitment to the community. And if those things check out, then to do our best to help those projects come to fruition. If you look at the commercial projects in our pipeline of pending projects right now, 85% or more relate to hydrogen. The market has brought hydrogen production, low carbon hydrogen production, to us because there are, as I'll share with you, there are a series of unique attributes here that are just hard to find most other places on the planet. This, it turns out, is a really exceptional place to produce hydrogen at scale for the global energy economy. And so that's one answer. It's where the energy market is going, and the energy market, one of the epicenters of the energy market is Corpus Christi, Texas, and the port of Corpus Christi for a variety of reasons. The other sort of more fundamental answer is if we, majority of people in this room think that addressing global climate, addressing carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions, but primarily carbon emissions, is a priority, and we want to do it actively, this is what it looks like. Finding other ways of powering our lifestyles, ways of diversifying, essentially diversifying the energy marketplace. That is how we begin to change the shape of that curve of carbon emissions, of greenhouse gas emissions. It's a messy process, it is an incremental process, but hydrogen is one of those fuels that will enable us to do it. And the reason that works is because you can burn hydrogen without reducing hydrogen itself, interestingly, greenhouse gas. You burn hydrogen, there's no carbon signature. So that is the answer. I mean, that's because this is what transition looks like.
So I think all of us that work at the Port of Corpus Christi get asked this day to day, several times a day even, what is hydrogen? And in the most simplest of terms, could we take everything that you just explained and break it up and just say it's these handful of simple things? What would be hydrogen 101?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for asking that, and forgive me for, sometimes it's hard to slow the mechanism down a little bit since I literally do this all day, every day. I mean, the hydrogen piece of this. And actually, that is a good reminder that we actually do have a few slides which may help. Let's try that without me. So, actually, and if I can share this one in response to your previous question, in preparing for this, just by circumstance, I came across this article that you can see the date down there, that I wrote in 2007. When I got out of grad school, I spent about 5 years doing freelance writing on scientific topics for lay audiences. And I wrote this article about climate in 2007. And at that time, I interviewed a bunch of professors working on climate where I went to grad school. And the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at that time in 2007 was 384 parts per million. And everybody I talked to was really nervous about the 400 parts per million threshold. The idea was, how can we possibly get there? Like, how can we avoid that? How can this be coming so quickly? Today's concentration, 421 parts per million. I mean, to me, this was a really striking sort of reminder of that, years matter. This is 15 years ago, and you can make the case that we as a global society have not taken the action we should have in the intervening decade. So for me, this was like a great illustration of the answer to why hydrogen, why now? Okay, so hydrogen 101, right? I'm gonna come back to this one. Let's start with this. Hydrogen is a really flexible energy carrier. It's a very simple molecule, 2 hydrogen atoms, H2. It's a very small molecule. It has been known as an energy carrier for literally, more than a century. But you can burn it directly without a greenhouse gas signature, or you can play with the electrons on the molecule and release energy. So a lot of us think most about hydrogen fuel cells powering automobiles. Those don't actually burn hydrogen. Fuel cells effectively move electrons around, release energy. The hydrogen ends up bonding with oxygen and forming water, and that's the only emission associated with fuel cell vehicles, so they're very clean. So hydrogen's utility is in its flexibility. Why does that, what other uses that are more germane to us here that are particularly relevant to the Port of Corpus Christi? Most of the industry in this region, and this is where this other graph, this other chart matters, most of the industries in this region are here because of cheap and plentiful natural gas that powers their operation. It turns out that you can blend hydrogen into a natural gas power stream in pretty high percentages, in some cases with relatively little modification of the combustion units. And with that integration of hydrogen, you're literally displacing carbon. So you're burning more hydrogen, less carbon in the atmosphere. So hydrogen as this flexible energy carrier is particularly relevant in an industrial environment like ours, where we are powering so much with natural gas. How do you make the stuff? You basically make it, and I can probably show you this. You make it a couple ways. You can make it several ways, 2 ways predominantly, and these are the ways that it will likely be made here. You can break up a water molecule, H2O, and you have hydrogen and oxygen. If you do that, and you do that by running an electric current through a machine called an electrolyzer. If you power that with electricity from a renewable energy source, that is no carbon hydrogen. I mean, there's no carbon footprint associated with that at all. People refer to that as green hydrogen, as electrolytic hydrogen, as renewable hydrogen. That all means the same thing. You're breaking up a water molecule and you're powering it with renewable electricity. You can also break up a natural gas molecule. Natural gas, CH4, you break it up, you have carbon, you have hydrogen. If you just release that carbon to the atmosphere, you're contributing CO2, greenhouse gas, to the atmosphere. If you capture that carbon emission, which is actually a pretty pure carbon stream, and you do something else with it, you either upcycle that carbon into another product, or you inject it underground and store it in the geology indefinitely, anything but release it to the atmosphere, you have created a low carbon hydrogen from natural gas. So instead of just burning that natural gas and releasing the carbon, you've broken it up into hydrogen and carbon and done something else with the carbon. That's called blue hydrogen. The likelihood is that we will see both produced here, but the majority of the projects that are in our pipeline right now, virtual pipeline, commercial pipeline, are electrolytic, renewable hydrogen, proposing to make hydrogen from water powered by renewable electricity. By volume, the total amount of hydrogen produced here may be slanted towards the blue hydrogen, the hydrogen from gas side. Unclear yet. It's just easier to get to scale with gas for a couple of reasons I can explain, but by number, the majority of the projects that are developing here right now, or emerging here right now, are green hydrogen projects. So that's where it comes from. Those are some of the uses.
And so then all of that goes into what has been referred to as a hub. So moving towards our Horizons Clean Hydrogen Hub, aka HCH2, why create a hydrogen hub here at our port? And perhaps most important, what would a hub actually look like here on the ground?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So just by show of hands, who has seen in the media any discussion of the Federal Hydrogen Hubs program? Okay, so who's here, sorry, forgive me for this, but it really helps me understand. Bipartisan infrastructure bill. Those words ring a bell for most folks in the room. Okay, so about 18 months ago, against all odds, the federal legislature passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which included billions of dollars to cultivate clean, as in low carbon, hydrogen production in the US, jumpstart a hydrogen economy, and then simultaneously billions of dollars to accelerate carbon capture and carbon management in various forms, curbing carbon emissions. And one of the programs that bipartisan infrastructure bill created was what's been called the Federal Hydrogen Hubs program, where the federal government is going to give up to about $1 billion to each of 6 to 10 regional hydrogen hubs. And the request for proposals to be one of those hubs came out last fall. The first phase was to submit a concept paper that said, we, X entity, and these partners are interested in being one of those designated hubs for the following reasons. 79 different entities around the country submitted concept papers to the Department of Energy to be hydrogen hubs, including the Port of Corpus Christi as the prime applicant in one of those hubs. In December, the Department of Energy encouraged 33 of those to submit full applications, including us. We were one of actually 5 in Texas. 5 of the 33 were in Texas, as I understand it. There's 3 for sure, some ambiguity, 4 for sure, some ambiguity about the other 1 or 2. Why seek that designation? The reality is that we, the Port of Corpus Christi region, the Coastal Bend, we are an emerging hydrogen hub, whether it is with the federal designation and the capital H's hydrogen hub or not, right? This is a hub, an emerging hub for clean hydrogen production, just based entirely on the level of commercial interest that we've received from dozens of entities all over the globe. unsolicited in large part. I mean, we are aware of the attributes that make us well suited as a place to produce low carbon hydrogen, and we're doing our best to accentuate those. But the market in many ways has found us. So the answer to why pursue the federal designation, in many ways it's a very natural thing to do given our emerging trajectory commercially anyway. What are some of those things that make us well suited as a hub? We're a very stable public entity. We've been here for a century. We're going to be here indefinitely. We have a long history of pursuing and receiving federal funds and building large infrastructure projects. We are a public entity. We are inherently beholden to the public trust. We are beholden to a degree of transparency that's consistent with the federal government's expectation for the grant in a way that a hub built entirely around private entities may not be. We have large tracts of existing industrial land. We have tremendous infrastructure assets, pipelines, docks that can be repurposed for this. If you look down the ship channel and you look out the window, you see docks that are moving liquid energy today. Those same docks will move vessels of the same size using the same depth in the ship channel to move liquid hydrogen products like ammonia or methanol. So for us, it is a very natural extension and evolution of our bread and butter business, what we are fundamentally as a port. And I think the last thing that I'll say about why the hub, we're the commercial common denominators of all of those couple dozen projects that seek to produce hydrogen in the region. Some of them will be port tenants on port property, some will not be, and are independent of us, but may move some of their cargoes to the port. So I should revise that. We're the commercial common denominator to most of them. We are in a unique position in that respect to develop infrastructure that serves multiple projects, which is more efficient for them, it's better for the community. We are in a position to facilitate synergies, put complementary projects on adjacent sites or on large format integrated campuses. So there are things that we can do as a public port authority as the cornerstone of a hub that are unique relative to other hub concepts around the country. So all of that was implicit in our justification, in our thinking in pursuing the designation.
So I'm going to stop you there.
Okay.
I've heard plates and silverware have stopped clinking. So we'll go ahead and open up the floor to questions. So if anybody has questions, we have some staff walking around with microphones, and you can feel free to raise your hand or walk up, and we can get started with questions.
Oh, okay. And at some point, somebody should ask what's going to look like on the ground, because I actually have pictures. Priscilla asked that, and I didn't show you, but I know there are some folks in here who want to see that. So if that's relevant, let me know.
So Jeff, thank you for that. Obviously, you and I have had this conversation a little bit about what this all means for this region and the hydrogen hub itself. But for those of us that are not maybe as informed, is this primarily a domestically consumed hydrogen? Obviously, we're an export-based port.
Yeah.
What's driving this at a global scale? Can you maybe speak to that? As I know that there are some countries that are very much at the forefront of the demand, right? And their governments have indicated as such. And so can you maybe speak to that as kind of globally what the market forces are doing as they are making their kind of transitions or plans for their transitions, and what the kind of incentive is from their perspective to do such? Could you maybe speak to that?
That's a great question. And it's actually, obviously the Department of Energy in distributing federal funds for hydrogen production is interested in jumpstarting our domestic hydrogen economy, first and foremost. Any hydrogen production on US soil is going to contribute to that. You're absolutely right that a lot of the incentive and a lot of the demand, a lot of that is coming from international interest, because we've seen really aggressive federal policy in various parts of Europe and North Asia. For example, Japan national policy. Japan has looked at sort of its power generation, much of which is coal, a third of which at least, right, is coal-fired, and looked at domestic energy demands and said, okay, we cannot today close coal-fired power plants. How do we but we are going to set aggressive decarbonization targets. How do we decarbonize those? There's interest in Japan and in Korea in bringing ammonia, which is produced from hydrogen. Ammonia, chemical formula is NH3. Okay, why ammonia? That's a good question. All right, so Japan, North, and Korea interested in bringing ammonia, for example, which can be literally combusted with coal in a coal-fired power plant to reduce the amount of carbon emissions and carbon consumed. In Europe, there's interest in hydrogen as a fuel source in itself to be blended with LNG and combusted. So we see these aggressive decarbonization targets being set in different parts of the world, and those are, for example, Germany, Japan, Korea. These are countries that cannot meet their own demand for hydrogen. They either don't have the renewables to produce hydrogen from water, they don't have the natural gas feedstock. These are companies that absolutely recognize that a large percentage of what they need, hydrogen or hydrogen derivative, has to be brought from somewhere else. On the flip side, the Gulf Coast is tremendously well endowed with attributes to be a net exporter. Absolutely, some of the hydrogen and hydrogen products produced here will be consumed domestically, just like a large percentage of the energy that is refined here is consumed domestically. But it's very likely that some of the initial investments will be underwritten by some of that international demand simply because some of those other nations I mentioned are moving more quickly, and their targets for having hydrogen available are more aggressive than ours. So we see the demand generation being a mixed bag of international, local, as will the where we send that hydrogen. And I actually, we'll get back to what it looks like in the ground. This slide this is a graph that just came out in a DOE report that came out this week. We actually have some copies of the executive summary. The DOE roadmap for clean hydrogen. It's a tremendous 50-page document, but it basically shows the Gulf Coast as the epicenter of hydrogen production in the US for all the reasons that we just talked about. You also asked why ammonia. I mentioned at the beginning, hydrogen, H2, very small, finicky molecule, and as a gas takes up a large volume. If you want to move hydrogen, you can move hydrogen as a gas in a pipeline very efficiently. If you want to move it any distance that you can't cover by pipeline, it's not efficient to move by gas. It's hard to, leak detection is hard, and it's not very space efficient. So if you want to stick it on a vessel and move it as economically as possible, turning it into something, a larger molecule like ammonia, something that you can liquefy more easily. To liquefy hydrogen takes a lot of pressure and a lot of cooling. Liquefying ammonia takes about half the pressure and half the cooling or less. Turning it into ammonia as a carrier is a very efficient way to move it. Ammonia, as I'm sure everyone in the room knows, is also the building block of chemical fertilizer. So ammonia, there's this gangbuster market for ammonia in and of itself. So turning hydrogen into ammonia is sort of a hedge because there's the ammonia market, and then there's the market for taking hydrogen, ammonia molecules and breaking it back up into usable hydrogen, or burning that ammonia directly as fuel ammonia. So ammonia is also a very flexible carrier of hydrogen, and that's why it seems like most of the hydrogen moving out of the Port of Corpus Christi by vessel, at least for the foreseeable future, will be in the form of ammonia. It will be other things as well, but at least initially, a lot of it's likely to be ammonia.
Oh, we got a question up here in the front.
Thank you. The port has been a tremendous energy or engine for growth recently, which I think is wonderful. It's great. How will a hydrogen hub contribute to that growth, create more jobs, higher wage jobs, I'm assuming?
Yeah, thanks. Really appreciate you bringing the community benefits piece, because frankly, that's the part that we should be leading with. I know it's of the most interest to a lot of people in the room and to most of the community. It's hard because getting the technical stuff out of the way is important to be able to just have the conversation. when you look at the Department of Energy's criteria for evaluating hub applications, about 40% of the criteria relate to how you demonstrate that that the communities in which your hydrogen hub projects will be built will derive direct benefits. What the intensity of those benefits are, quantified benefits, and your ability as an applicant to demonstrate that at least 40% of those benefits will be directed to historically disadvantaged communities. So there are acute, specific, measurable criteria in the application process that hold us to account on that. So we actually have really good data on this. Going to take a little additional detail, but here are the numbers. And we've got Rosario Bailey in the room, who is our Director of Community Relations, and between she and Leslie Ruda, our Director of Planning, are on point for the community benefits plan associated with the application. So we can go into as deep into this you want to, but by the numbers, when we talk about just the 9 projects in the hub for which we're proposing federal funding, which is only about half or less than half of the total hydrogen-related projects that we see emerging in the hub, but they're the ones that are covered in the application. I think the number was somewhere around 1,800 permanent, high-paying technical careers, up to literally 20 or 21,000 jobs in the construction industry over the life cycle of those projects, just for, again, the 9 projects that and please tell me if I'm wrong on those numbers, right? In terms of capital investment, that $1 billion of federal money, we were able to demonstrate by the scale of again, just those 9 projects, easily a potential 20-to-1 private investment to public investment just on the hydrogen production components of those projects. So not even in the case of projects that want to also produce ammonia or methanol or something else with the hydrogen, we didn't even count that investment. We wanted to be conservative about what that leveraged private investment was. So, and that's, I'm only answering the jobs and capital piece. On the benefits plan itself is fundamentally about identifying the discrete, unique priorities for each of the communities in which those 9 projects will be located. And they span from Matagorda County to Duval County to Pecos County, one in Cameron County to the south, and then 5 of them in the Corpus Christi region centered around the Inner Harbor, most likely. The benefits plan is about sitting down with community partners in each of those communities and understanding what discrete priorities are in those communities, rather than assuming that we today can project the best way to invest in individual communities. To be specific, in some communities, the barrier to access for these new clean energy jobs is childcare and transportation in some of the West Texas communities. That's very different than the case in Nueces County, right? The priorities in Nueces County are on, so as we've heard so far, STEM education, a more structured and systematic framework for cultivating a pipeline of talent in historically disadvantaged communities and creating access to jobs. So the benefits plan involves everything from direct investment in community programs to direct investment in community institutions, but the amount of money potentially available for that benefits piece is profound. It's on the order of $25 million for just the centralized benefit pieces, plus all of the ancillary investments by all of the individual projects. For the benefits pieces, independent of the workforce development, independent of the private investment in the projects themselves, right? The infusion of capital that generates tax revenue. So that spectrum of benefits has the potential to be really transformative.
Jeff, I do think it's worth mentioning, and since we're on the topic, do you mind going to that second to the last slide?
Thank you. And I keep forgetting that we have this resource, and I'm just talking off the cuff.
I think it's important to point out that our hub has investments of upwards of $19 million dedicated to education and workforce development. And it's very specific to some of the things that Jeff was talking about. How do we take those resources that we have in our community, and how do we take those individuals who are currently working in industry, and how do we provide them with the skills they need for the new jobs or the jobs of the future? And how do we invest in the students who are obtaining their education here in the Coastal Bend and in those additional 4 counties that will be impacted by this project? And Jeff talked about the community having impact in the decision making. And so I think it's important for us to talk through some of this stand-up groups that you will see through our hub. And it starts with the Community Partners Roundtable, which is a group of individuals made up of people from these 5 counties that will have a voice and will lead the efforts to tell this top group, the Community Benefits Steering Group, who is the group that will then designate how we distribute the funding, okay? So it starts, again, down here at the Community Partners Roundtable and the Empower Group. So the Empower Group is made up of your elected officials from these particular groups. So your Empower Group and your Community Roundtable Group are making these decisions. They're selecting people from their group, their peers, to be a part of our Texas H2 Advisory Council. Your Texas Advisory Council is lending their voice to the steering committee. So everybody has their hands in this decision-making aspect, and everybody is lending their expertise to how this money gets distributed. And I think that's so important for us to lean on.
So when Rosario says how the money is distributed, that is not the $1 billion funding the hub.
No, it's the community
for projects.
funding.
It is the $19+ million dedicated, as a cornerstone of that community benefits programming, not the entire amount dedicated to community benefits, but the budgetary element that is specific to it. So I want to be clear about that.
Correct. And Jeff also talked about the investments that are coming in with regards to these capital projects. And earlier in his conversation, he said some of these things are just going to happen, right? So why now? Why hydrogen? This can happen with or without the hub. What happens without the hub is we don't get these investments in our community. The community doesn't get a say-so. The community doesn't get $19 million in investments. We don't get to establish these groups. So that's what we do get to stand up with our hub. So I think that's critical. And in addition to that, we're looking to establish a nonprofit group that will then continue the investments and continue to drive efforts to raise additional funding through those capital investments that are happening in the community. So that just drives additional income for additional initiatives throughout the community.
The hub application process has forced us to start building out community infrastructure that allows us to spend federal dollars in a systematic, transparent, equitable way. There are some of the work we've done in the planning process for this application over the last 4 months, between January and April, we will be able to implement with or without federal support. It has accelerated years worth of work on our part. There are certain things that come with that federal designation and the infusion of federal dollars. It just accelerates, it catalyzes investments that would take us orders of magnitude more time to accomplish without federal support.
Thanks for clarifying that, Jeff.
Thank you. You mentioned before that you had something you could show us what the hydrogen hub would look like and how it would impact the immediate communities adjacent to that. Could you show us that, please?
Yeah, happy to. Let me backpedal here. So this is what hydrogen production at the port looks like today. Pulled this off of Google Street View. This is Upriver Road. Any of you can drive by and check it out. This is the Air Liquide, what's called SMR, or steam methane reformation unit. It's where a methane molecule, natural gas, CH4, is broken up into carbon and hydrogen. Again, if you capture that carbon and do something else with it other than release to the atmosphere, that becomes a low carbon hydrogen, a blue hydrogen. There are about 1,000, the nameplate capacity for hydrogen production like this in the port today is about 1,000 tons per day. There are several units like this owned by different entities. So this is what hydrogen production from natural gas looks like. You can see there is a flare. I can't make this pointer work, and I'm trying not to feedback on the microphones, but there was a flare in the background somewhere there, kind of tucked behind the SMR unit itself, and you can see the storage tanks as well. That's the visual on hydrogen from natural gas. This is what an electrolysis facility looks like, a facility making hydrogen from water. Similar tanks, you see the electrolysis units up front. They're modular generally in construction, and so and larger facilities just stack more and more of those modular electrolyzers. I'm making very broad generalizations because there are different types of electrolyzer technology depending on the membranes, but in general, they look like this. Note the absence of a smokestack, right? Note the absence of a flare, because when you're breaking a water molecule, the only emission stream is pure oxygen, which is typically caught, captured, and monetized because it's a valuable product. One of the problems, incidentally, of having a large concentration of green hydrogen production is you end up producing a lot of pure oxygen and there's not enough demand for it. So a lot of hydrogen projects end up, they contribute their oxygen to hospitals. If there's there's some industrial use for oxygen, but you produce way more oxygen than you need as a byproduct. So here are a couple other visuals of, so I should mention, this facility, this is a hydrogen fueling station owned by Iberdrola, which is a Spanish company I think this is actually in Madrid or Barcelona, it says on the bottom. The American subsidiary of Iberdrola, Avangrid, is one of the partners in the hub, one of the potential project owners in the hub. None of the projects in the hub have reached a financial investment decision, which is why I keep saying the word potential, right? All of this is still potential. But they're veterans of the hydrogen industry. Iberdrola is one of the largest renewable generators on the planet, and Avangrid is one of the largest renewable generators in the US. This is, is this the Japanese Fukushima plant? Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is a green hydrogen facility built right next to the famed Fukushima nuclear facility, or what was once the Fukushima nuclear facility. You can see that the electrolysis is literally powered by the solar that is just across the fence. So behind the meter electricity, behind the meter meaning it's not supplied by the grid. So no carbon electricity, power and electrolysis. So this is what those facilities look like at the ground. Industrial to be sure, but not nearly as intensive from an industrial standpoint as much of what is on our landscape today.
And so the one in Spain and this one are making hydrogen from water?
Yes, ma'am.
And if that is what is projected for here, where they're going to get the water?
Yeah, great, and thank you. I knew that question was coming. Sorry, the question was if the, and I'm going to add a annotation here, if the majority of the projects in the pipeline, hydrogen projects in the pipeline here are projects that propose to make hydrogen from water, or at least part of their feedstock would be water and part would be gas, where's the water going to come from? The simple answer to that is the water is going to come from wherever any of us or any other industry is getting water. And the reason I say that is because we as a community are in the process, and absolutely must be in the process, of developing new water resources, whether that's Evangeline Aquifer, whether it's desal, whether it's doing a better job of reusing effluent. I mean, the answer to this is and, not or. Water security in this community has to be a multi-pronged solution. And we can talk about desal a little bit as it pertains to hydrogen, but today, all water users put their straws into the same cup. The idea that any one user is getting, all of us are getting the same surface water resource, right? It's all the same water that is delivered over 100 miles to the region, treated in one central facility and distributed. Not all users are using potable water, although we are using potable water for things that don't require potable water, which is in itself an inefficiency. So my answer to this is whatever the solutions are for this community in terms of how we bolster water resources, that is the water that supplies green hydrogen production. Green hydrogen production also does not, look, I mean, it's based, you're splitting a water molecule, so there's a mass balance of how much water it takes. It's very easy to determine. But let me give you some numbers, because I think some of you will be surprised by how much water is or isn't. The number that the Department of Energy uses for electrolysis, and remember, different types of electrolysis with different efficiencies, but in general, and Errol's gonna hate this because it's a mixed metaphor of metric and English units, but 4 gallons of water per kilogram of hydrogen. The reason we talk in kilograms of hydrogen is because most of the hydrogen demand on the planet is not from the US, and where most of it uses the metric system, Europe, Asia. The DOE also talks in terms of kilograms. So 4 gallons per kilogram, so you do the math on that, you can put a ton of hydrogen, 1,000 kilograms, is about 0.004 million gallons per day. We talk in million gallons per day of water. How much is a ton of hydrogen? Well, I said that we have 1,000 tons of hydrogen produced here today. A couple things about this. Making hydrogen from water inherently requires water. Making hydrogen from gas also requires water. I want to be very clear about that. Depending on how you break up a gas molecule, if you do it with steam, steam comes from water. If you do it with something called autothermal reformation, you need water, some water for process, but you also need water to cool the equipment. Some of that water can be salt water. It doesn't have to be treated fresh water. My point with this is that everything we do in this community in an industrial sense requires water. And there's sort of a fundamental existential decision point in that. For those of you who raised your hands at the beginning and believe that decarbonizing the energy economy, addressing climate is an existential necessity, is something that we as a port, as a community, should fundamentally be engaged in, that requires a transition. We cannot just, it's not a matter of just using less energy, right? So this is what that transition looks like. There is a water requirement associated with it, and the answer is that water comes from however we as a community decide to meet our water needs.
Okay, Jeff, we have one over here.
Jeff, I got a very basic 3rd grade level understanding of what you just said. Most of it I didn't understand.
I'm sorry.
But to build a mental image at
Sure.
the 3rd grade level of why we want to have a hub here, what is the need for hydrogen? Very basic question.
Yeah.
How many users of hydrogen do we have on the ship channel today?
Great question.
What is the quantity that they use? And then what would be the foreseeable distribution of the product produced by a facility here?
Okay, let's take those one at a time. The first piece about was what? Can I phone a friend on this, Priscilla? Why? The why hydrogen piece at the beginning.
If we could break that down
Yeah.
to a little bit more and just,
I can work backwards also. I remember the last two. Who's using hydrogen today and how much?
yes.
Okay, all the refineries use hydrogen today. That is how you desulfurize crude and create refined products. So almost all of the demand for that 1,000 tons per day or so relates to petrochemical refineries. They're today's hydrogen users. They are part of the hydrogen demand in the near to intermediate term, but they are not the lion's share of the demand in the long term. Anyone in the industrial region who uses natural gas to power their operations, so the folks who are making steel and steel products, the list is very long, right? Anyone today who's using natural gas, which is most of our industry, has the potential to displace some of that gas power stream with hydrogen. Anyone else who wants to make a refined product would also use hydrogen, so any new kinds of refining other than petrochemical refining. Anyone who wants to make synthetic fuels. There's a lot of conversation in the media around sustainable aviation fuel, right? That's SAF. That's this buzzword because we've seen some European policy driving it. If you want to make synthetic fuel, you need hydrogen as a feedstock to make synthetic fuel. If you want to make, we'll stop there, right? The short answer to this is the potential demand for hydrogen, the emerging demand in the ship channel is exponents of today's demand.
So if we stop there and we go back to your list of questions, what would be helpful for Jeff to explain next so that we can build upon that?
Let me catch those again one at a time.
Well, basically, from an economic point of view, is
Benefits.
how much of the United States manufacturing industries, what's the demand? How many facilities are there today that is producing the product to meet that demand, which establishes the need for more hubs and that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Okay.
And, and then how much of that, obviously, a lot of the stuff that we produce here, a smaller percentage remains here than it goes worldwide distribution.
Yes, thank you. One of the challenges to answering that is those numbers are not static points in time, because the whole point of the Hydrogen Hubs program is to jumpstart a hydrogen economy. The future that the DOE envisions is literally a network of hydrogen infrastructure where hydrogen is one of, if not the prevailing way that we power all aspects of our lives. Fuel our cars, power our homes. So at some point, and I think with the hub's investment, it happens faster. The answer to your question is the demand for hydrogen is a proxy for the demand for power. It's a function of a growing population. It's a function of the way our communities work. But the leading edge of that is the demand in industry. If you look at this chart, right, this is carbon emissions. A quarter of the carbon emissions on the planet are associated with the energy demand of industry. We have a low-hanging fruit here because of the concentration of industry. You look at those top emitters, they're all represented here as sectors. It is industry that will underwrite the investment in a hydrogen network. And so answering the question of who's producing hydrogen today and whether that market exists today, the answer is probably no. At this moment in time, there is far more interest and investment in hydrogen production than there is demand at this moment in time, unequivocally. It is betting on the future energy economy. And there's a speculative dimension to that. But the other thing that's important to realize is that the investments that are being contemplated today, and I said none of the projects here, not a single one of the projects, is yet at a financial investment decision. So the investments in production that are being contemplated today, that production, those first molecules of hydrogen are still, at best, 3 years away, maybe more. This is about being on the front end of that hydrogen economy. It is about being on the leading edge, not the bleeding edge, but the leading edge. And and we as a community have a really unique opportunity in that.
Hi. Historically speaking, in different parts of the U.S. and I think you said Japan, right? Fukushima or something like that. Industry has destroyed cities and areas. So my question to you guys is, when is there enough industry for this area? And why is it the Coastal Bend's responsibility to solve issues at the expense, global issues at the expense of our way of life here?
Yeah, I think those are really fair questions. The good news for me is those aren't mine to answer. Let me unpack why I say that. Two questions there. One was, when is industry enough in this community? And two, why is it our responsibility to embrace and try to solve a global problem? Let me start with the second one, because I think it's an existential question. Climate is unequivocally a global problem, and that's an important distinction. CO2 is not a local air pollutant. It is not impacting air quality and climate of life locally as an emission, as opposed to NOx or SOx or particulates, the things we talk about as criteria air pollutants that affect our community. There's a distinction there that's really important. However, global climate and the impacts of a changing global climate on the planet affect us as a community and as individuals as much or more as anyone else on the planet. We are in a low-lying coastal community. When we talk about the changes on the planet that manifest as climate becomes warmer and less stable, intensifying and increasing storms, intensifying drought, more erratic rainfall patterns. I mean, these are the things that absolutely affect us as a community, affects our quality of life, affects our quality of place, affects the fundamental livability of the Coastal Bend. So I would argue that being part of the decarbonization of the global energy economy is self-serving. First of all, because I think there's a commercial opportunity in a clean energy economy that looks very different than the industry of the last 100 years. There's an opportunity for this community in a direct economic sense, but also because that being part of that climate solution is an investment in ourselves as well. I mean, global climate is called, the global climate crisis is referred to as global for a reason. It is not, that burden is not borne geographically only by certain parts of the world. It's borne disproportionately by certain parts of the world, but it also impacts us. When is the industry enough? I mean, look, I'm going to editorialize on this, but the bottom line is that we as a port are not the reason industry is here. We as a port are here because industry is here. There's there's a positive feedback loop in that, to be sure. The assets of this port attract other investment. You unpack that chicken or the egg, it's kind of a senseless thing because all of this, that's historical, and I prefer to talk about what comes next because that's what your question was. A third of this community is employed in industry, right? So I think the question is, what is the future of this workforce? What is our future growth trajectory? That is not for us to decide. The port as a utility is here to make the most of commercial investments for the betterment of the community as long as they are compatible with environmental policy, our land use policy, and the interest of the community. And there is a rigorous filter there. There's a filter there that is very different than the filter that was in place 5 years ago, 8 years ago. This is a very different port and a very different community. How much industry is enough? To some extent, that's for the community to decide. I think it's very important to recognize that when we talk about a clean energy economy, it looks dramatically different than the industry of the last 70 years.
So we do have some time left. I want to make sure that we get all of our questions answered. I know that we had some really good questions in the first session, so perfect.
Hey, Jeff. I was listening very carefully, and you started out with green hydrogen, which is fantastic. It's great. Of course, the water issues are going to be huge. But I never heard a percentage of which ones are going, how many are going to be blue and how many are going to be green, and what's that percentage? Because it does use a lot of water as well.
Yeah.
And then the second part of my question, this is pretty easy, is the CO2, carbon sequestration, has really yet to be proven. And so that is going to be a big concern. Are you concerned about figuring that out in the meantime while we're trying to get these industries in place?
Okay, two fantastic questions. Let me start with the second one first, if that's okay. Well, actually, sorry, I'm going to flip that. Let's start with your first one. So by the numbers. And I will say, it's really interesting because someone, one of your colleagues at the last event was advocating for hydrogen from gas feedstock because it seemed like a sure bet. It's really, from a water standpoint, it's very interesting how there are so many dimensions to this. But within the hydrogen hub, within the proposed use of federal dollars, this is driving me nuts, I'm sorry, it's probably tough for you guys as well. There are 9 projects in the hub to which we're proposing to direct federal dollars. 5 of those are local. All 5 of the local are green hydrogen projects. Of the other 4, only one of them is a gas feedstock project, and it's in the Permian. It's in Pecos County. It was the cornerstone of the Trans-Permian hub, which we assimilated into our hub. Outside of our hub, in what we call affiliated projects that are geographically relevant, but for which we're not proposing federal dollars, all but 2 of those projects are also green hydrogen projects. We have 2 very large projects that are proposing to at least use some gas feedstock with carbon capture for either use, upcycling into other products, or geologic storage. Let me divert from that, Patrick, because you know what CCS is. For everyone else, 30 seconds. When you capture that, what would be a CO2 emissions into the emission stream into the atmosphere, it's very pure carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide's a gas. You put it under enough pressure, it turns into a liquid. You can inject that liquid about, in this area, 5,000 to 7,000 feet underground. There's a Miocene era sandy sort of aquifer. Think of a sandy water slurry, like if you dig a hole at the beach near the water line. You can inject that pressurized carbon dioxide in liquid form under pressure into that area, into that geologic horizon. In certain parts of our coastal plain, there's a shale cap that contains it, and that CO2 can stay there literally forever, indefinitely. Doesn't work everywhere. You have to be thoughtful about where you do it. You don't want to do it in areas where there are a lot of relic wells necessarily, or where there are faults. There are, if you do it in the wrong place, that CO2 bubbles back up to the atmosphere. If you do it in the right place, it stays immobile under pressure indefinitely. Transforms over time, but it stays put. If you do that successfully, and it technically, it's been proven, and this is where I'll disagree with you a little bit, that the technology of CCS is decades old. The economics of CCS only became viable very recently with some help from federal subsidy. We can talk about that if you want. Failure of CCS in other places around the planet has been economic, not technical. So to answer your question, do we have uncertainty about the technical efficacy of CCS in this region? Absolutely not. Are there places in this area where CCS makes more sense than others? Absolutely. Are there places where there are, the geology is such, faults, as you know, in a certain part of Ingleside, where it doesn't make sense to do it? Absolutely. So with the 45Q tax credit and the $85 tax credit per ton of CO2, the economics of CCS are arguably viable for the first time in history. And if you look at project failures, the ones that are typically cited, they're not technical failures, they're economic failures. So I don't have reservations from a technical standpoint. The permitting process for CCS is protracted. If I have a concern, it's that our ability to deploy carbon sequestration our ability to get it permitted and built may lag and be a limiting factor in the blue hydrogen production. So if I have a concern, it's on the cadence of deployment and the uncertainties in the regulatory process, not in the technical deployment.
So I'm not sure if you can answer that. I'm going to ask anyway. So a lot of the questions around water, and obviously that's been a topic in the community. So can you quantify, you mentioned there's, I think, 1,000 tons of hydrogen produced roughly today.
Yeah.
What would that equate to our water supply today? And then moving toward this hydrogen hub, how much more water would we need to meet that future demand?
Yes, great question. And I'm going to apologize in advance because it means hitting you with some numbers, right? The 1,000 tons or so that's produced here today and has been produced here for literally decades, and as long as we've had refineries, we've been making hydrogen. It's produced by breaking up a gas molecule, natural gas. There is water involved in producing steam. I don't know what the water demand is there. I think it's somewhere around a gallon or 2 per kilogram. If there's somebody in the room from that sector, please feel free to chime in. So I don't know what the aggregate is around that 1,000 tons per day. It's relative to the industrial demand, water demand in the region, it's de minimis. In the hydrogen hub, I mentioned 9 projects, 5 of which are local. If you add up the total production of those 5, it's a little under 1,000 tons per day. So another 1,000 of those green hydrogen projects. So it was 0.004 MGD per right? So per ton. So 1,000 tons. I think by our math, those projects, the projected water demand is somewhere, I think that ends up being somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 million gallons per day. Substantive, not dismissing it, but not the kinds of volumes that you hear for some other industry. To be clear, full transparency, those are 5 projects, electrolytic projects. Those are not all of the projects that are interested in being in the region. Those are the projects associated with the hub. I have the best numbers for those because we had to quantify it for the application. The blue hydrogen projects, I think that, again, I think the number that the Department of Energy uses is about a gallon or 1.3 gallons per kilogram of blue hydrogen for the production. So we call it a quarter of the water consumption if you're making it from gas. You need that's for the production part. You also need a lot of water for the cooling, but we understand from the 2 entities that want to produce hydrogen from gas in the region that it is possible to use untreated seawater or bay water to cool their equipment. It doesn't necessarily have to be fresh water. So even though there's a large water demand for cooling, it doesn't necessarily have to be part of the demand for fresh water locally.
I think we had a question up here in the front.
Thank you. Jeff, I must commend you on, and you and Priscilla, for this presentation as opposed to the one that I attended a couple of weeks ago at lunchtime. Not only is it more informative, but the exchange is much better. And I want to commend you for changing the format. This has been much better. The application that you submitted to the DOE is for this, what I'm calling a prototype. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but essentially it's a test run of producing hydrogen, generally in the inner harbor here, and using a minimal amount of water. You know, you said 3.5 to 4 MGD. But how does that translate? How does this application and this small little hydrogen hub translate to what we're hearing is going to happen in San Patricio County? We already know Enbridge and Mitsubishi are planning a joint venture to produce hydrogen. Some time ago, the port entered into an MOU to explore it. The port is building a massive solar farm over around McCampbell Airport to generate power for all these facilities. How does this small little prototype of 5 some odd, I know 9 partners, but they're spread out, how does this apply to that area? And I'm not going to hold you to what Mr. Strawbridge has said in the past, but at the most recent city council meeting in which he appeared, he said that green hydrogen requires an enormous amount of water, and that your prior projections were that 50 MGD would be plenty, and now you're looking at 100 to 150 million gallons of water a day for the future for this green hydrogen. So how does this all jive?
All right,
Okay,
look,
thank you.
No, I mean, so much embedded there. I want to try and unpack it. Starting at the beginning, thanks for the feedback on the format. We heard you last time. This hasn't been perfect, but we're a work in progress. We're going to be doing these regularly.
We also
Welcome any
added
feedback.
a curtain just for you.
We're, you know, so don't be shy with the suggestions about how to do a better job with this. Working backwards, starting with desal. To be clear, I said this last time, need to say it here for this group. When the port undertook desal permitting in 2018, hydrogen was not a glimmer in our eye. Hydrogen is not the motivation for trying to advance the development of new water resources. Could desalinated water be used to produce hydrogen? Absolutely. I said earlier, the water for hydrogen comes from wherever our water comes from, whatever source is, plural, we develop for as a region. But to be clear, hydrogen was not, and I will say is still not, the primary impetus for our involvement in desal. Let's park the desal piece. But I think, so I understand, especially a little bit out of context, why Sean's comments, which I don't remember exactly what they were, I understand how there seems like an inherent conflict in this. I'm going to try to unwind that a little bit. How does the hub relate to those larger projects in San Patricio County, which are not technically part of the hub, and it would involve some gas feedstock? They're much different scale. Let me lean in on that. A couple things. I know 5 hydrogen projects as part of the hub sounds de minimis and token and demonstration, but compared to the amount of green hydrogen produced on the planet today, it's a profound increase. Look at a couple of graphs. I can make these slides available. All of this is from sources like DOE, so I can share these with whoever wants. This is where electrolysis, green hydrogen, is taking place today and at what scale. Very minimal sized facilities, tiny facilities, scattered. And this is where green hydrogen is emerging. Notice that the largest dot, the largest concentration of announced, not at financial investment decision, announced green hydrogen projects is in the coastal bend. This should be a badge of honor. I mean, this is taking the legacy of our role in the energy economy and turning it into a decarbonized future that represents a completely new economy for the community. And this, you we'll leave it to you to take this as you will. But so the hub, the projects in the hub, even those 5 projects, I would say, first of all, they're not just token demonstrations by any means at scale. Are they enough to bring the world to scale, that future I mentioned where we're powering our lives by a hydrogen network? No, they're not, but they are definitely an essential proof of concept. I mean, how do they help catalyze that? Specifically, they require new hydrogen infrastructure, new pipelines. Part of the money that we're asking for the Department of Energy for would fund those. We're lucky in this community because we already have pipeline rights of way. So our ability to build new connective infrastructure to underpin that hydrogen distribution network, we can do that very efficiently with minimal, if any, new right-of-way acquisition, because we are a spaghetti of pipeline rights of way. We also have 110 miles of hydrogen pipeline in the port area today. But with each investment in hydrogen production, it is a point, a geographic point on the map, a place where we are going to need new connectivity. That is how you start to build out this network of the hydrogen economy. So that's why, from the DOE's perspective, these investments in different regions beget other investments. The hub money will specifically be used for some of that connective infrastructure. How do those projects relate to the projects that you've heard about in San Patricio County? Just to clarify, the Enbridge project you referenced is on Enbridge property in Ingleside by the Bay, not port-owned property, is not affiliated with the port in a direct sense. Obviously, if Enbridge moves commodities, whether it's ammonia or crude by water, they're moving it through the Corpus Christi ship channel, of which we, the port, are the steward. So we have a commercial relationship. Honest truth, I did not know about the Enbridge ammonia project until I read about it in the paper when there was a press release, just like anyone else in the room. So not all hydrogen or ammonia projects in the region are port projects. So there's the Enbridge project. You mentioned a project by Mitsubishi in San Patricio County. Those projects that will use gas feedstock can get to a very different scale much more quickly than the electrolytic projects. Electrolyzer technology to break up water molecules is still very much emerging. It's not that the technology is unproven, the technology at large scale just has not been done before. I mean, I showed you that map a second ago. And there's a backlog in electrolyzer production. There are new electrolyzer plants being built all over the US and all over the world, but they're a few years away from having electrolyzers rolling off the conveyor belt. So how do those projects relate? The answer is only indirectly. Part of the advantage in our case of having a hub format where we're concentrating projects in integrated campuses or in places where there's already hydrogen pipelines, already docks that can move liquid hydrogen projects, that is part of the way that we can accelerate. We de-risk those projects. They become more affordable to put on the ground because of the economies of scale and the infrastructure we've already got in place. That's how we catalyze those green hydrogen projects. But the infrastructure we're building for those clusters doesn't obviously serve directly projects across on the other side of the bay. Concentrating projects on similar campuses across the bay has the potential to create similar economies of scale, but they're independent of each other. You mentioned the solar project. Look, there's no one in the room who's going to argue that the South Texas electric grid will not benefit from new sources of electrons, new source of electricity. diversifying the ways that we produce electricity in the region is good for grid resilience. Even if those, and secondly, those are no carbon electrons. It's solar. And the facility design, elevated tracking panels without hydrologic impacts to the wetlands on the site. I mean, we can get into that if anyone wants to talk about the solar project. But producing 500 megawatts of no carbon electricity, whether it goes to the grid or it's used by a local industry who would otherwise be using electrons off the grid, leaves more electrons on the grid and is good for the resilience of the grid and the region. Full stop. That is a feel-good story. I mean, could it be used to power green hydrogen or blue hydrogen? Yes, it could. Will it necessarily? No. There's tremendous demand for power, existing and future, in this region, and those electrons could go anywhere. We don't know where they're going to go. We don't have a development partner for that project. First step at a time, permitting a solar facility. For anyone who didn't catch the reference, we own about 3,000 acres around McCampbell Airport for which we are permitting solar development. We will eventually seek a private sector partner for that development. And that's what Errol was referencing. I don't know if I caught all parts of your question there, Errol. Okay.
If not, you know where to find him.
And we're going to do more of these. I mean, we'll keep your seat warm in the front.
So we have gone over a little bit beyond what we promised we would keep you. So we do appreciate everybody coming here after work. I know this is on your free time, and we've changed the times a little bit. So to what Jeff said earlier, any feedback is appreciated because that's going to help us build more of these type of conversations. You don't have to speak up and give us the questions now or the feedback now. We all have emails that you can reach us by. So personally, I want to thank you for coming here today. I've learned a lot. I think I still have more questions, but that's what we're here for, and we'll continue to seek to do these things, and not necessarily even in this location. We've talked about other locations, so dates to be determined, but I appreciate your time, and I know that Jeff has some final words as well, and maybe Rosara.
Okay. Yeah, look, I mean, I'm a lot. I don't know why, I wouldn't sit through 90 minutes of my explanation, so really appreciate so much that you all are here, took an evening to be here. If anyone does have more questions, want to talk, I'll stick around as long as any of you care to. We're going to try to do these on a recurring basis, not just about the hydrogen hub as it evolves. The hydrogen hub is a long-term proposition. This is a slow burn. We intend to do these, we're going to strive for quarterly over the duration of the application project and hopefully hub implementation. If we don't get designated as a federal hub, many of these projects were here before the hub application project and will likely be here after. This is a likely part of our future as a port and as a community. And so these conversations are not purely a function of that DOE application. We're going to have them as frequently as it makes sense. We'll try to mix up the times. We'll try to mix up the venues. We would welcome feedback on that. Same with the format. But again, I think above all else, I just want to say thank you so much for making the time to be here. And we're going to try to do a similar thing around CCS. We think these conversation series around a particular topic create a chance for a deep dive. And so we'll be doing other topics and on off cadences and hope that y'all will join us for those as well. So thanks a lot.